We've been working on a series from the other week. And it was called For God and Country. And just kind of a quick review on some things that we've been talking about in the series For God and Country was that we kind of jumped in and said, well, we want to have the right perspective on this, and the way we're doing that is we're following along throughout the book of Jeremiah. So Jeremiah was a prophet called by God, and so we're going to follow what he's doing and how he's interacting and how he's responding to God. And one of the things we see about from this prophet that we can definitely learn from is he had the right perspective when it came from this idea of for God and country. He had the right perspective, because when we think about it, and we may be prone to do this, and you may know people that do this, is that sometimes in our hearts and minds, we swap these things around. And so we have to have the perspective that Jeremiah had. That we put God first. That it's centered on God. Our devotion, our worship, our priority is about God first. And then country. Because when we do that, if we're swapping these around, then we're no good to our country. Because we're bringing godlessness into the country. And that's not good. We can't serve our country. We can't be good citizens. We can't be mindful citizens. We can't be wise citizens if we don't have God first. Otherwise, we might as well be puppets and just do whatever our country wants, whenever it wants. And you can imagine why that could be a problem. Lots of countries go down the road of demanding pretty much your devotion and worship and everything that you have to offer. And then after they have it all, they direct you to do evil things. And so there's a cautionary tale with that. Now when God calls Jeremiah, he responds in a way that he's basically saying that he's unable and he's unacceptable. God calls Jeremiah, and it's an interesting introduction because it's, quite unlike how he calls the other prophets. He tells Jeremiah from the very beginning, I knew you when you were in your mother's womb. I made you like this. You're my prophet. And Jeremiah says, basically, I'm unable and I'm unacceptable. Do you remember how he responded exactly? What he was saying? How was he unable?
About being young.
Well, that's the unacceptable part. What's the unable part?
Couldn't talk good.
Yeah, he could not speak. Yeah. See, the prophets were meant to stand before kings and officials and elders and high priests, and they had a very important position. I mean, you're talking on the line of Abraham and Moses and Samuel. And this young boy, we don't know exactly how old he was because the text doesn't give us, but the way it's kind of used in Hebrew and stuff is probably the line of he wasn't military age yet. So he's under, probably 20 or something. So he's unable. He says, I can't speak to these people. I can't do this. And I'm unacceptable. I'm going to be out of place because I'm going to be the young guy and they're all going to be looking down on me. It's unacceptable for me to take this role. Now here's the thing. Think about this. God knows Jeremiah better than anybody else knows Jeremiah, right? And God tells Jeremiah that basically from the beginning. I knew you in the womb. Before you were even born. Why do you think God might call prophets who turn it down? Why does God call prophets when he knows their first reaction is going to be, I can't do this. I'm not acceptable. Why does God call reluctant, hesitant prophets when he knows from the beginning they're going to be reluctant and hesitant? Why might he do that?
Like the rest of us.
Like the rest of us? And maybe they don't want the job. But why does he call people that don't want the job?
Try to get them accustomed to doing other things.
Okay.
To show others it's possible.
To show others possible.
To rely on him.
To rely on him. You see, God knows that he's going to get the pushback. He knows he's going to get rejected in this. But he still calls prophets, and we see this happen with Moses and other places. You know, he still calls them, even though he knows their first reaction is, I can't do that. Because he wants to show other people. He wants them to step into a new role. He wants to show them how exceedingly great he can do things, even when they are exceedingly hesitant. God's going to do he has great plans for Jeremiah, even though Jeremiah is exceedingly hesitant. But you realize there's a bit of humility that comes with this. There's a bit of humility. There's a bit of humility that says, I'm not exactly up to this. And then God steps in and says, I'll take care of that. I'll take care of that. And so Jeremiah pushes back initially. I'm unable. I'm unacceptable. And that's how this begins. And then God responds and starts to fill in the gaps. Now, if you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn from the Old Testament to the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah chapter 1. We're still getting our feet wet, still kind of at the beginning of things. So God calls Jeremiah. Even though Jeremiah pushes back initially, I'm too young for this. I can't speak well enough to communicate like I need to. And then you see God's response. And we'll pick up in verse 7. But the Lord said, do not say I am only a youth. You must go to everyone I send you and say whatever I command you. Do not be afraid of them. I'm with you. I will deliver you. So God promises his presence and his power to this very reluctant prophet. He promises his presence and his power to this very reluctant prophet. And then we see how with this initial call and getting Jeremiah's attention and telling him he's going to be a prophet, he gives Jeremiah two visions of the future. He gives him a glimpse of what the future could be like. Okay? So this is right from the beginning of Jeremiah's call. God is already speaking to him in visions. And that's our focus today. A glimpse at what the future could be. He's already speaking to Jeremiah in visions to get him to understand what the future could be. These are not just visions of what's going on now. These are visions into the future. He's giving Jeremiah a glimpse into the future. Now, maybe you thought about that at some point. About you kind of, especially during the COVID year and how everything was, there's probably at times you probably wished, all right, how does this end? How does this, kind of work itself out? How does this, how do we get to a different place in our nation and in the world after COVID? Now, you probably wondered in the midst of, what the future would be like. But think about that. If God gave you the opportunity to know what the future would be like 1 year from now for you, Or say 5 years from now for you. If God gave you the chance to know that, would you really want to know it? If God said, I will show you what is happening in your life 1 year from now, or I'll show you what is happening in your life 5 years from now, would you want to know it?
No.
Maybe no. Maybe no. Maybe you'd be curious. Maybe there'd be some things, that you're going through now and something you're dealing with, and you kind of want to see how that works out and what happens and, all that kind of stuff. But you might be like on the other side of that fence and go, well, maybe not. Maybe not. And so when Jeremiah gets these visions, we may initially think, oh, it's so great to be able to see into the future. But we may, if we think about it, we may come across on the other side of that fence and go, well, maybe not so much. The visions that he gives him, these two visions, are not necessarily written in stone yet. These are what the future could be. What the future could be. Basically, God is saying, if this nation doesn't change, if this nation doesn't turn back to me, if this nation doesn't stop fighting me, and remember, they're at the point in their life, the nation's life, where they're doing the worst of the worst. They've got pagan god statues in the temple they dedicated to God. They're sacrificing their young boys and girls to foreign gods. There's a giant fire with a statue called Moloch. He's a god from another place. And they brought that in there, and they're worshiping him by doing human sacrifice, their own children. That's how bad it's got. And God says enough is enough. Jeremiah, tell him. Tell him. And so this is at a low point for this nation. They've gone about as far from God as you can imagine. And he tells them about what the future could be. You keep going down this road, you keep doing this, this is where that road leads you to. Jeremiah, tell him. And he gives Jeremiah two visions. Let's pick up and look at verse 11. It says, the word of the Lord came to me. And it says, what do you see, Jeremiah? So you're seeing something, Jeremiah. Identify it. And Jeremiah says, I see the branch of an almond tree. Almond tree is a very common thing in that part. In fact, if you go to the town where Jeremiah was originally from, there's still almond trees all over that place. It's a common feature seen around that part. So he's not seeing anything fantastical, something, just where he has to use his imagination. He's seeing something very common. Very common. He says, I see the branch of an almond tree. In verse 12, the Lord said to me, you have seen correctly, for I am watching to see that my word is fulfilled. Now, there's a couple of different things going on here. The almond tree in Hebrew is shaked. That's the word for almond, shaked. And see, God says, you have seen correctly, for I am watching to see that my word is fulfilled. The word for watching in Hebrew is shoked. So these are words that sound very, very similar. In fact, if they were said, fast, you'd probably have a hard time picking them out. What's different? So Jeremiah is seeing something that he sees every day, probably, or at least a lot. And God is saying, every time you see that, you know I'm watching to make sure that I keep my word on this. Every time you see that almond branch, you're walking through your town, you're going through Jerusalem, you see it, you'll know that's a sign. Now, the other thing about the almond branch is that the almond bloom and all for spring is the first one that shows up in that part of the world. So it's a sign that things are changing. That we're going from, winter to spring. So God is speaking to him in this vision, something very common, something he would see, very frequently. And God says, when you see that, know that I'm watching. Know that that's a sign. And things are about to change. Now think about how hard that is to deal with. Think about how hard that is to deal with. Anybody think back to the Christmas Carol. And Ebenezer Scrooge, right? Ebenezer Scrooge, bah humbug, right? The book from Dickens, and they made the movie over probably, 50 times already. The ghost of Christmas past, the ghost of Christmas present, the ghost of Christmas future. And what is the ghost of Christmas future telling? What the future could be if he doesn't change. And that haunts him into changing. That sticks with his mind. That stays with him. That motivates him to change, because the ghost of Christmas future in the Christmas Carol shows him, Ebenezer, this is your future if things don't change with you. And God is showing him something very common with the almond branch. And every time he sees it, he knows, yes, Lord, if things don't change, I know you're going to take care of it. I know you're going to judge this nation. Moving on. Verse 13. The word of the Lord came to me again. What do you see? God's telling me again, identify it. Make sure you understand what I'm showing you. He says, I see a boiling pot tilting away from the north. And the Lord said to me, from the north, disaster will be poured out on all who live in that land. I'm about to summon all the peoples of those northern kingdoms. So that's the second vision, a boiling pot, just boiling over. And it's in the north, the northern part of the country, and it's tilting over, and it's about to flow down. That scalding water, it's about to be poured out onto the south and to the rest of the Judea. That hot, scalding water is representative of those northern kingdoms, the enemy. When that invasion comes, it's going to come like scalding water. And that's where it's going to come from. It's going to be a cleansing water. Because God is going to take care of this. And again, a boiling pot. Something Jeremiah would see frequently. Every time Jeremiah ate, he probably saw a boiling pot. I don't know where these things would fly today. It might be something like if God told us, every time you see pollen in the spring, that's the way you know that I'm watching and I'm going to do what I said. That might be how we would look at it, because we're so used to seeing clouds of pollen, or pollen on our car, or pollen in the air, however. Or God might say, every time that microwave goes off, you'll know, every time you're about to eat, you'll know that the invasion's coming. But he gives him these two very common things that he's going to see again and again and again and again, and God's reminding him. Tell them. You know what's coming. I've told you to tell them what's coming. I've given you these visions to remind you, to stick with you. That boiling pot, every time you see it, you better be thinking that invasion's coming like scalding water, and it's going to come from the north into the south, just like it did. Every time you see that almond branch, you know I'm watching. Things are about to change. He goes on and he describes, he says, I'm about to summon all the peoples of those northern kingdoms. The kings will come and set up thrones at the gates of the Jerusalem city. They'll come against all her surrounding walls, against the towns of Judah. I'll pronounce my judgment because of their wickedness and forsaking me, and burning incense to other gods, and worshiping what they made with their hands. He's promising, guys. And he's spelling it out for them. Verse 17, get yourself ready. This is what he tells Jeremiah. Get yourself ready and say to them what I command you to say. Do not be terrified of them, or I will be terrified before them. Today I have made you, check this out, I have made you a fortified city. I have made you an iron pillar. I have made you a bronze wall. See, he's describing Jerusalem, the city, falling apart. And he says, but I made you, Jeremiah, a fortified city. The walls of Jerusalem are being pummeled and they'll be torn down. But I've made you, Jeremiah, a fortified city. The structure is being torn apart by enemy soldiers, but I've made you an iron pillar. I've made you a bronze wall. See, everything is falling apart around them, but Jeremiah's not. Everything looks like it's just falling apart around them, but Jeremiah's not. In the midst of all this chaos, and in the fear of these northern armies coming in, and this is not just any northern army, this is Babylon. This is the beast of armies at the time. And they come in and everybody just melting in fear. There's Jeremiah, like a fortified city, like an iron pillar, like a bronze wall. While everybody else is falling apart, he's not. When their world looks to be falling apart, he's not. When they look around and they see what's happened, and they're thinking God has abandoned us, they can see in Jeremiah, no, he hasn't. He's just bringing judgment. God's man is still there. He's still there. Now here's the thing. And you may discover this in your own life, and maybe you already have. People need a fortified city, an iron pillar, and a bronze wall in their life. Because you might be the person when it looks like somebody in your midst, when their world is falling apart, when they can't see past the grief, when the pain in their life and what they've been through just consumes them, when they're just overwhelmed with fear, when they can't imagine going to the doctor and getting the diagnosis, when the future looks so bleak, you can be this for them. In fact, you may be called to do that for them. To be that fortified city. To be Christ-like. When they feel like maybe they've been abandoned by God because things just seem to go from bad to worse, you'll be there. Just tell them and show them that they haven't been abandoned. You know, men, it may come as as a dad. It may come as as being a brother. It may be coming as a son or a husband, but some point in those situations and those relationships, you'll probably be called on to be that, to carry the burdens for others. Because when the world looks like it's falling apart, you're not. And you can be that blessing to other people in the midst of all that chaos in their world. Women, maybe you've already experienced this. As a mom, comforting a child. As a daughter with your mother and father. As a sister. When it looks like everything is falling apart and nothing is right and people are despairing, God puts somebody in the midst to carry the burdens, to show God's presence as a fortified city, iron pillar, a bronze wall. Because when everything's falling apart in the crisis, you're not. And you can be that for people. You can carry those burdens. You have the Holy Spirit. People need that. So as we go to this last song today, that's what I want to put on your heart and mind. Because in the midst of a chaotic world, a depressing world, a world with so much evil, God may want to use you in that crisis to carry that burden and to be that fortified city, to be that safe place, to be that strong place, to be Christ-like.